Hello, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started in just a moment. If you'd like to take your seats. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Simoes. I am the Executive Director of the Nacke S. Loeb School of Communications and the New Hampshire Solutions Journalism Lab, which you'll hear more about in a moment. I want to welcome you to the first ever New Hampshire News Philanthropy Summit. We're so excited to see you here and to see you in person after so many, many months of seeing you on small boxes on my computer screen. I am delighted to be here with you. We have reporters and editors in the room from local news sources that are 150 years old, as well as reporters and editors from new online sources and print sources and radio and television sources who have come into being just in the last few years. And they are thriving despite the challenging news environment that we are in. And while it is important for our state's news industry to be gathered together when we have the opportunity to be, it's really all the rest of you in the room that make this event truly special. We have some of the state's most generous corporations with us. We have foundations who invest philanthropic dollars in our communities with us. We have state and local policy leaders and policy advocates. And I want to say welcome to those who have helped to support local news or who are thinking about supporting local news in the future. What we're going to do today is to discuss how news aligns with community need. You'll be hearing from industry leaders about what's happening in local journalism in New Hampshire and what they are doing to find new ways to bring news and information to the public. We'll learn from some newsrooms in New Hampshire about how they have approached supporting news and the challenge of that by using community partnerships. We'll have a Q&A session with local leaders who will answer what led them to supporting news in New Hampshire. And before we came here together, I had the pleasure of interviewing a few of you in the room. And I wanted to tell you what some of this cohort had to say about why local news matters. Local news support builds both audience and defends information. Local news provides the social glue that brings communities to life. The future of any community depends, at least in part, on arming citizens with better information about the problems they face, as well as potential responses to those challenges. Local news funding is about recreating a piece of the fabric of democracy and community. So I think we could all start with some agreement that there need to be new models to support independent, competitive, professional, ethical, local news. Today's summit is just the start of that conversation with a group of people who really care about getting this right. And by supporting local journalism, you're going to gain a deeper understanding of issues, create outreach, engagement, solicit feedback from your community. You'll learn about the needs of the place where you live and help to find solutions for the challenges that we all face. Mostly, though, today is really about the start of making connections and discussing what could be possible. I think it's fair to say that everybody in this room is here because they love their community, they love their state, and they feel that bringing more local and independent information will make for a healthier New Hampshire and a stronger democracy. I hope I'm right about that. That's a big assumption. The beauty of New Hampshire is always, I think, that we get to chart our own course and we get to find fixes for problems that are unique to our state and that involve all of us. So I think that today we start to take a big step forward to doing just that. And I am so grateful to have all of you here. I want to say thank you to Steve Leone and Melanie Plenda, who were my co-hosts for today. They are friends and colleagues. We are forged in fire. We are steeped in details, and we are very happy to be here presenting to you. As a bit of housekeeping, we're going to take a break halfway through the day. There will be box lunches set up on this table over here. There are refreshments there now. You don't have to wait for the break. Get up, move around, be comfortable. There are restrooms where you came in, as well as a bubbler if you've brought your own water bottle and want to refill. There's also water, coffee, and tea on the table. There's going to be a resource table when you exit today with copies of materials that you'll be hearing about. We'll also provide those to you in electronic form. We'll be following up with you. We'll send you a recording of today's program and invitations to future events so we can continue this conversation. I want to say a really big thank you to the Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College. If you ever have the chance to work with Neil Levesque and Ann Kamen from the Institute, do it immediately. They are wonderful partners, and they make everyone who comes into this space feel more organized and more professional. They make you look good, and they are incredibly generous with their time. And I want to say thank you to Concord Community Television for being here today to record the program and for setting up a live stream. Hello to those who are watching us remotely. They did this at the very last minute to help us out because some of our partners couldn't be with us in person. And Josh Hardy has been the definition of flexible and cheerful and helpful, which feels like no small feat in these times, so thank you so much, Josh. Nathan is here from Report for America, also filming, and you'll be hearing more about Report for America in just a moment. Thank you again for being here and for participating. I look forward to speaking with you again in a moment. Steve?
Okay, welcome everyone. So it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for the day. For those of you who have been following local news, you'll know Report for America has emerged as a national leader in this industry. They're helping to address the critical need for more reporters. They were featured earlier this year on 60 Minutes. They're among the biggest success stories in our industry. And I personally believe that if you look back in 10 years, that we're in a moment where we're actually making change right now, and a lot of that change is being fueled by places like Report for America and the people in this room. For those who are unfamiliar with Report for America, let me fill you in on what they do. So they're a national service organization. So just this week, they placed 300 journalists, and more than 300 journalists actually, in over 200 newsrooms in all 50 states. So 5 of those journalists are going to be in New Hampshire, and they come on June 1st. This group of journalists keeps growing. And they do this by helping to fund a portion of the reporter's salary. Now, the local news organization then has to go out and commit to actually working with their community to find more dollars to help fund the remainder of that position. And that's what kind of fuels making these positions sustainable. And please note the words I use to describe them. They're a service organization, so they believe, as we do, that the role of journalism is a service. It's a service to our readers, our listeners, and our viewers. So this is a big mission, and like all big missions, it requires really big, ambitious ideas, and it requires the people to help make that happen. So that's Lauren McCowan, today's speaker. So she's Vice President of Development for the Ground Truth Project, which is home for Report for America. And then over the past 3 years, she's led the team responsible for growing Ground Truth from a $2 million organization into a $14 million organization. Right? And that's placing local reporters at scale across the US and globally. Right? So this is really what makes a difference. She's a nonprofit strategist, she's a program designer, she's a fundraiser, she's a storyteller. She's worked at MIT D-Lab and Pathfinder International, and she's studied international relations and journalism at Michigan State. So in short, she's kind of seen this industry from all different perspectives. And this wouldn't be on a resume, but I had someone from Report for America tell me that the biggest thing is that she is the heart and soul of Report for America. So please join me in welcoming Lauren McCown.
Hi, thank you so much, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you today. I think I'm going to enlist Steve as the new spokesperson of Report for America. He tells that story much better than we do. I want to start by sharing a story with you today that's really stuck with me over the course of the last few years. I'm going to take you back to that time in the pandemic when we had stopped scrubbing down our groceries before bringing them inside. We'd maybe gotten tired of baking the sourdough bread. And a mom in Biloxi, Mississippi, we'll call her Allison, was scared. She was scared for her family, like so many of us were at that time. Things were beginning to open back up. We were thinking about going back to work, back to school, what that would mean for all of us. But Allison had a pre-existing condition. Her husband did as well, and her son was diagnosed with autism. And so going back to school, it opened up her family for risk. And so when the local school district sent out a form sort of asking folks if they could qualify for virtual learning, be able to, sort of learn from home, Allison ran into a bit of a snag. She was working her way down that form and came upon the question, do you have internet at home? Now, Allison and her family couldn't afford internet at home. Ours had been cut back at work. She was an attendant at a local gas station that had been cut. And it wasn't possible for them at that moment. So she checked no, and her son was denied for virtual learning. And when a Report for America Corps member, Isabel Taft, heard about this story on a local Facebook group, she gave the family a call. She kind of heard their story, took it down, tried to kind of understand the dynamic, and gave that school district a call, as any good local reporter would do, called up the superintendent. And it turned out the superintendent didn't actually know that they were denying folks for virtual learning based on this kind of simple piece of information. The school district just didn't know. And so within a matter of days after Isabel's report, the school district actually reversed course and provided free hotspots for students who couldn't afford internet at home to facilitate virtual learning for that entire district. And so what's so powerful to me about this particular story is that Isabel wasn't FOIAing for really hard-to-find records. She wasn't doing weeks and weeks of really deep investigative work, although that work's incredibly, incredibly important too. She was just doing some really good listening, engaging, taking in the story, calling the right people, and even more, connecting them with each other. And so for me, this is all about what we do. This is at the heart of what we do at Report for America. We really support and enable original on-the-ground reporting, often by your neighbors, folks that are already in that community, at the local news organizations that are already out there doing incredible work. And so we do this work because we know that there's no replacing Isabel, right? There's no fancy algorithm, there's no tech platform that's going to come along to replace that human capital. But we know, as we're gathered here today, that that human capital is really expensive. It's not always easy to make that happen, right? And meanwhile, we're facing a colossal collapse in local news across the country. This is a crisis that predated the COVID pandemic. Before the pandemic, over 1,800 communities across the country had no local news source at all, and hundreds more were ghost newspapers. So we think of a reporter playing the role of editor, business manager, publisher, trying to keep the whole thing alive, and lots of folks out there doing that. A recent study actually showed that just 17% of what's in a local newspaper these days is actually local news. The amount of reporters that's been lost means that those pages have to be filled with wire and national news. So it's really, really difficult for us to get the local news that we need and that we deserve. During COVID, as many of you know, that crisis accelerated. Over 100 local news organizations across the country closed, and over 36,000 reporters were laid off, let go, or had their pay cut during that period. Advertising models have really struggled as online advertising has grown. We know that today, 2 out of 3 online advertising dollars go to just 2 companies, Facebook and Google. And we know that those business models of the past are not coming back. As been mentioned here today, we've really got to get creative and think through what are those future revenue sources. We also know that the communities that are hit hardest are often rural communities and communities of color. And this is one of the many reasons that we support a variety of different types of business models at Report for America, really trying to support news organizations wherever they are serving the communities who really need it most. So what's at stake, right? It often feels like we have so much information coming at us at any one time, right? We get on Twitter, we're inundated with national cable news. What difference does it make if we lose a local news outlet, if we lose a reporter in our community? And although we know that the impact is unique in every community, the footprint's different across the country, there's some things that academics tell us that have really put democracy at stake. For us, the crisis in local news is a real crisis in our democracy. We know first that civic participation takes a massive hit. In a community that's lost its local news source, voting rates go down. The number of folks who run for candidates who run for office actually go down. The other thing that we know is voters like you and me are less likely to split our ticket when we vote, so polarization actually goes up. There are also some more surprising ones that we wouldn't think of as often. Pollution rates go up in communities that have lost a local news source. We've seen that firsthand at Report for America, where our core members have held officials accountable for a toxic waste dump in a community that was removed after a Report for America core member reported on it, or a lack of air pollution monitoring in a community where wildfires had really changed air pollution levels to a very, very dangerous level and got air monitor pollution put back into that community so that they could really monitor the air quality. We also know that when local news is lost, bond ratings go down, borrowing costs go up, right? Nobody wants to invest in a community where there's no one watching the store. Really critical to have reporters there to play that watchdog role. And finally, it's harder and harder to track and predict pandemics like COVID-19 without that critical information that local news is providing to help us understand what's happening at the local level. I experienced this firsthand this year when a foundation executive in rural Minnesota explained to me how her foundation had to step in to provide basic information about COVID testing and COVID infection rates when the local news outlet in her community was lost. It's a role she never saw her foundation playing, but really had to kind of step in and play that role. And so, to me, these impacts show us that saving local journalism isn't actually about saving local journalists. It's not about saving local news outlets. It's really about improving, strengthening, connecting our communities. It's about education. It's about our climate. It's about equality. It's about justice. So I want you to kind of think back for a second to that example with Allison and her family in Mississippi. There are dozens of funders across the South who are investing really heavily in education, and their work is incredibly, incredibly important. Our ask to them is a consideration to additionally support in journalism on education so we can know what's happening in those education systems, understand, assess, and connect communities to find those solutions together. So what do we do? What can we do about all of this? Sometimes it can feel like doom and gloom. Those are big numbers. Over the past 3 years at Report for America, I've had an upfront seat to really see the incredible work that we've been able to do with our local newsroom partners across the country. As Steve described, we're really, really lucky to partner with these incredible news organizations, over 200 this year in all 50 states. And our role with them is really to think about how can the national match that Report for America provides be leveraged to really bring local community stakeholders on board. We have learned a lot over the course of the past 3 years. It was very much an experiment at the beginning, and we are learning a lot more as we go. But we're really excited about what we've seen so far. Just over those few short years, and during a pandemic no less, our local partners raised over $13 million just for their core members alone. So we're really proud of their work. And perhaps what's even more exciting to me is that these donors are not necessarily the wealthiest in the country with the deepest pockets. These are grassroots donors. They are lawyers, teachers, dentists, farmers. They are community foundations, corporate giving, local businesses, the car dealer who used to advertise in the local paper who's now giving philanthropically. And so that's been incredibly exciting. And it can be simple. One of my favorite examples in this past year came from friends of ours in El Paso at El Paso Matters in Texas, who funded their Report for America core member covering women's issues by creating a good old-fashioned giving circle. They asked one woman in the community to make a gift of $1,000 and to ask her friend to make a gift of $1,000. And so on and so on. And over the course of just a few weeks, they had raised $70,000 for this reporting position to fuel it into a second year of work. And even better, this reporter was coming in knowing that she had incredible support from the community. So we were really, really excited to see that. And I'll also say perhaps one of the most exciting things we see in this data is that communities below the poverty line are performing just as well, if not better, in our data than communities that are at or above the poverty line. So this isn't a story of very wealthy communities being able to build this back. Americans are generous in every community across the country and really are understanding and seeing the case for local news and how it connects to their communities. But is it possible? Where can philanthropy step in and play this role? Can it cover the whole piece? We know that we're going to have to get really creative with the models that we lean into in the future. One of the biggest questions prospective donors ask me in my day job at Report for America is, how much? How much do we need? What does it take to solve this whole problem? And so my colleague, Steve Waldman, who's the author of a landmark 2011 FCC report on the crisis in local news, has really done some work to study and understand what is the size of the problem. How much local reporting does our country need to have a healthy information ecosystem? And what we know is that about $1 to $3 billion a year is what it's going to take to build and sustain that system. That may sound like a lot. It is a lot. But we also know that Americans give $450 billion a year philanthropically to the causes that they care about. So what we're really talking about is a 0.2 to 0.5% shift or increase in the philanthropic giving to adequately support and enable this healthy information ecosystem. Now, creating a shift in an entire American philanthropic landscape is no small task, but we're beginning to see this change over time. Thanks to national donors like the Knight Foundation, a growing ecosystem of nonprofit news partners. I know we have Solutions Journalism Network here today and a number of others. We're beginning to see this change. Community foundations are giving record amounts to local news to support it as they see it connect to their community, to their democracy. Every week, I get an opportunity to talk with a new local, a new national donor who's saying, we're exploring this for the first time. We know just how important it is to tell our community's story and to really enable good journalism in our community. How can we get started? And that's one of the most exciting parts of the job. For us, and for me as a fundraiser at Report for America, it's not just about growing our budget, growing our mission, it's about growing the entire philanthropic pie so that this entire ecosystem can really thrive and have what it needs to succeed. As much as I love my work at RFA, it's going to take a lot more than national programs like ours to make this happen. We know that it's going to be place by place, brick by brick, community by community. It's going to take all of us. It's going to take all of you. And it's really going to be about figuring out what works best for the place. We know that it's not one size fits all, that every community is really going to have to understand what their needs are and build that back to be able to have the local news that they need and deserve. I want to share with you a recent trend that my colleagues at Report for America have tracked and really documented over the course of the last few years, the rise and emergence of something called community news funds. These are funds that are going above and beyond making a grant here or there to a local news organization and are really making a multi-year, multi-donor commitment to local news in the long run. We just released a report a couple of months ago on the rise of these funds, really chronicling through case studies across the country, from the Inland Empire in California to Traverse City in my home state of Michigan. And what we really love about this trend is the incredible ambition behind it. This is not about just putting a Band-Aid on an issue and moving on. It's really about creating a systemic change and a commitment to the local news that our communities need and deserve. Last year in Traverse City, the editor of the Traverse City Record Eagle called up his local community foundation. Report for America had given him a corps member covering Indigenous affairs in Traverse City for the first time. They'd never had a reporter covering Indigenous affairs. And he said, I need $20,000. Report for America gave me this national match, and I have to get out there and raise the other half. And the community foundation director on the other end of the line sort of stopped him there and said, we can raise $20,000 in a couple of hours with a couple of phone calls. What do you really need to serve Traverse City? And in that moment, that funder didn't have a solution. He didn't have every dollar raised for what that paper needed. But what he did is really acted as a catalyst. The community foundation there seeded the fund, but perhaps even more important, they set up meetings across the city to bring in folks they knew would deeply, deeply care about this issue. And in just a matter of a couple of months, they're working on raising a $300,000 fund for the city of Traverse City to have local news sort of across the community. A few weeks ago, we were really delighted to have overwhelming interest in this concept at a webinar that we hosted. We had over 150 community foundation leaders from across the country join us to learn more about how they, too, can create their own community news fund. So we're really excited about this momentum, hope that that's something you all might think about and consider, and if there's anything that we can do to help or support that vision, we're here and very happy to talk after. In a few short minutes, you're going to be hearing from some really incredible news leaders from across the state of New Hampshire who are finding creative and collaborative ways every day to improve and get news to local communities across the state. We're really, really honored to work with folks like the Concord Monitor, Valley News, Granite State News Collaborative, and New Hampshire Public Radio to support corps members this year covering really, really important issues: education, inequality, justice, equality, environmental issues. These partnerships, too, have brought some new and sometimes unlikely supporters, something we're really excited about. Just as one example, the Concord Monitor has done some incredible work bringing new partners to the table. In the past year, Steve and his team have secured support from supporters as diverse as Northeast Delta Dental and the Merrimack Savings Bank. To me, these examples show that philanthropic support can come from all corners, and that for many donors, the motivation to get in there, contribute, and support this work is sometimes the thing we can all be scared to do sometimes, myself included, even though this is my day job. We just have to get out there and ask for the support that we need. So what can you do today? What can you do right now? I love a good action list. It helps me keep my head on straight. Some things you can think about as you have conversations today and kind of take the conversation forward. One, I would be a really crummy fundraiser if I didn't tell you to get out there and support as generously you can the local news organizations in your community. We really, really encourage folks not just to support very restrictive sort of coverage on specific topics, but think when you can about general operating, unrestricted, multi-year support where you can. This is the stuff that keeps the lights on and keeps the kind of behind-the-scenes overhead staff like me on board to help keep the newsroom running. And so hugely, hugely appreciate your support for these incredible local news organizations. But perhaps even more, it's not really about the money at all. It's really about making connections. It's about opening those doors. What 2 or 3 introductions could you make today for a local news organization to connect with the right folks that they need? Who can you bring to the table? How might you be able to connect? For example, are there folks managing a donor-advised fund in your community where you could potentially make an introduction and help folks become aware of the really great work that these local news organizations are doing? And then finally, I think for me, and this goes a little bit counter to the news organization, but I think we're getting there, is the kind of notion of collaborating, not competing. This has been a really competitive industry for a very long time. To me, the collaborative and the amazing work that you're doing here in New Hampshire is such a testament to this notion that we go farther and faster together. And we've seen that really across the industry as our peer organizations, national funders, local funders are leaning in. We've just gotten a lot more done more quickly together when we're there, just kind of in it together. And sometimes that feels a little odd, but often if local news organizations can, band together, have that community foundation meeting together rather than going apart, you might be surprised what you're able to find. So I will wrap there. I want to thank you all so much for being here today. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I will turn it back over so we can hear from some of these fantastic lightning talk speakers. Thank you so much.
All right, well, thank you, Lauren, that was great. So now we're going to move into the segment that we're calling our lightning talks. And this is really getting at the issue of solutions, what's being done around the state. Because there's a lot of really interesting things that are happening in New Hampshire right now. And there's a lot of things that are about to happen in New Hampshire, all geared toward meeting this critical need. Now, we're going to do this fairly quickly, so I just want to make clear that this is about, New Hampshire in general, right? The Monitor is going to be talking, the Union Leader, NHPR, Keene Sentinel, the Daily Sun. We're going to talk data journalism, the Granite State News Collaborative, but this is just to give a flavor. Journalism needs to succeed all over the state, and please make connections to those in your neighborhood. So my segment, if I was going to give a lightning talk and it had a title, which it doesn't, but if it did, it'd be called How One Door Opens Another, all right? Because I think this is really what this is about, right? This is why we're here. This is what we're trying to do, open new doors. So we're halfway through 2022, but our connection to what we're now calling community-funded journalism and community-funded partnerships, it really started back in 2018. Now, in New Hampshire journalism, New Hampshire Public Radio does a great job, New Hampshire PBS, they've done a long time, they've done a good job of pulling in foundation funding and in partnerships. But for me, the one that really hit home was the Union Leader. Right? Back in 2018, they were in the midst of Beyond the Stigma, which was addressing addiction and treatment. And it pulled in from a lot of different resources. And it really, I think, got a lot of people, myself included, thinking, well, that is a model that we can replicate. That is something that we can do kind of on our own terms. So it started a conversation in our own backyard. We went to Concord Hospital, which is a big institution in Concord, and discussed about the need for local reporting, right? And they understood, as a healthcare industry that is interested in the health of their community, how important getting good information was. So we didn't know it at the time. At the time, I didn't even know what I was asking for. I was just wanting to communicate to them that local journalism is something that needs to be supported and that they were an institution that in some way could help contribute in a way that supported local journalism. So then by 2019, learned about Report for America. We submitted an application, right? And the next thing you knew is we had applied to become a Report for America newsroom. We then started conversations with the Charitable Foundation. And then by early 2020, we were interviewing for new positions for health and education that would be coming to the Monitor that were 100% covered by community funding. Then the pandemic hits, and we struggled for a couple months waiting for these two people to arrive on June 1st, 2020 to cover health and education, probably the two most critical needs at the time, and perhaps the two most critical needs going forward, right? This is about capacity. This is about just getting people out there, you know, making phone calls, communicating really important information on public health. So June comes, and it really felt like they were coming over the hill. It was like the cavalry had arrived, and we put them out to work. They were coming to New Hampshire. They did just an unbelievable job informing the community. So, you know, we can think of journalism in terms of what project are we working on, but a lot of times really what we need is just journalists doing what journalists do, which is going out, making phone calls, knocking on doors, talking to people, and meeting the need. So fast forward now to 2022. So what have we learned? What has the Monitor learned? We've learned that there's a lot of ways to go about this, and there's not really a right way. But I thought it'd be useful to take you a little bit behind the scenes on what the Monitor did to just, you know, build this into our business model. So step number one, engage with your readers. What are they interested in? What do they want to learn more about? What do they need to know? And listen to them. Step number two is engage with the community stakeholders. What's important to them? And again, listen to them. Now, admittedly, that's a lot of engagement, and engagement takes time. So we hired an engagement editor who spends much of her day doing just this. That's Allie in the corner. She's going to really hate me for pointing her out, but she's done an unbelievable job of building engagement as a fundamental piece of what we do. So now you have all this information, you understand better what people want and what people need. All right, so at the Monitor, we took all that information and we identified 4 topics that we felt were critical to our communities and that could be supported by community-funded journalism. Those topics were health and education, which I already mentioned, disparity in the environment, as 4 fundamental pieces of what we need to do for the community. And we started to build around that. We've answered questions of how do you handle editorial independence to ensure that no funder controls the narrative. And we work to connect the dots. Who in your community may want to support these efforts? And we built really a lot of communication. What is our story? How are we going out into the community to say, hey, we think this is an important issue and we would like your support, and this is what support looks like. Finally, you got to make the call, right? Once you have all this information, you have to go make the call, and you have to knock on doors just like a journalist, and you have to make the request. And it's a hard case to make sometimes, especially if no one has heard of this concept before. And in some cases, it's a foreign concept. But sometimes you find the people that just intuitively get it. They understand how good reporting meets community need. You know, I work for Newspapers in New England, which is a family-owned collection of newspapers and news publications. And we've been with our communities through thick and thin, going back centuries. And we value the role that journalism plays in our communities. And we've made this a commitment to look for community funding and to apply that community funding to more journalism, because we feel strongly that more journalism makes for a better New Hampshire. And, you know, that's our version of how we're rebuilding local news. And I'm really just anxious to hear about how others are going about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming today, and thank you for Steve and Laura and Melanie for putting this together. Thank you for coming here. I'm going to tell you a little story, too. I'm inherently lazy, so if I have to write a lightning talk, I write a column out of it, too. I need to use the same material because I just don't have time to do both. So I'm going to read part of that to you. This came out a couple weeks ago, and it came because I thought if I'm going to talk about this subject, I'm going to share it with readers, too, because I'm not sure they really know what we're doing. I mean, we do engage with the public. We do tell them about these projects. And we have a little, shirt tail at the bottom of all our projects that lists all the funders. But over time, right, you need to remind people because that just becomes something that they see but don't really know what it is. So the headline is, and this sums up what we do with these solutions projects, stories seek solutions to state's challenges. And this came from an unlikely place. Last Thursday, a despondent man was threatening to jump off the Piscataqua River Bridge. A police detective was credited with saving his life. Using her training, Portsmouth Police Detective Rochelle Jones listened to the frustrations and heartaches that drove the young man to that moment, and eventually, she persuaded him to climb a ladder to safety. It's the story that might have faded fast if not for union leader reporter Sean Wickham. Events like these are often reduced to a few paragraphs. A routine report might have focused on how the bridge was shut down to traffic for 2 hours and not so much about the human story that unfolded. Maybe be a little brief in the newspaper, 15 seconds on the TV news, over and on to the next thing. Sean has always expressed great empathy in her work. I know. I sit across from her. I hear her phone conversations. She's very good at getting people to talk to her. And she was compelled to pursue this story. Once she heard that a detective had talked this person to safety, she wanted to talk to that person. And I asked her about it after the story ran, because Sean spent a year writing about substance abuse and mental health issues under the Beyond the Stigma project. And she said, yes, she was compelled, because she had spent so much time talking with people who have this kind of training and the kind of sensitivity you need, she wanted to tell that story. And it seems like a small story, but it was an interesting story and it was a hopeful story. And I want to read now a quote. We have some pamphlets in the back that talk about one of our projects, what's working, what's still underway. But it mentions some of the other projects, and we have a few testimonials, and I love this one. It's from former Chief New Hampshire Supreme Court Justice John Broderick, who was a longtime advocate for mental health. It was the only time in my memory, he's talking about Beyond the Stigma, it was the only time in my memory that any statewide publication had cast a penetrating light for a sustained period on the many obstacles faced by people, families, and communities dealing with mental illness and the numerous collateral challenges those obstacles created. Most importantly, it probed solutions that were working in New Hampshire and across the country. Here's my favorite line. It was hopeful. Solutions journalism, by its definition, is looking at a problem and not just saying, look at all these bad things that are happening, look what your government's doing, look what the problems in your schools and workforce and mental health, but also finding who's doing things that are working. What communities have found ways to solve these challenges? Now I want to read some of our sponsors, and I want to clap because a lot of them are here today. I'm going to clap in advance. So for the Beyond the Stigma, it was New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center, NAMI New Hampshire, which is the National Alliance for Mental Illness, and some private individuals. We also had support for Silver Linings, which was about aging and aging issues in New Hampshire from the Endowment for Health. And What's Working was supported by Eversource, also Dartmouth-Hitchcock, New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, Northeast Delta Dental, Fidelity Investments, New Hampshire Coalition for Business and Education, and the New Hampshire College and University Council. I could not remember all of those because some of those titles are so long, but together over about 5 years, a little more than that, $350,000. The Endowment for Health was probably about a third of that. And Karen Ager, who's sitting here with us today, and you'll be hearing more from her, I called her a couple days ago because I wanted to get her thoughts on, she pretty much started this, at least for us, and I think for a lot of us in this room, by bringing the Solutions Journalism Network to New Hampshire. Tina Rosenberg came and gave a talk. And if you've been a journalist for a long time, you know what Solutions Journalism is because we've all done it. This is putting a name on it and giving it a brand and thinking about it in a more direct way. We've all written, if you look at stories that win awards, they're usually stories that there's some solution aspect to it, because finding something and not finding a way to make it work, what's the point, right? So Karen not only brought Solutions Journalism Network to New Hampshire, she approached the union leader about funding a project. And it took a number of months for this to work, and it was brand new. And I think that's one of the things that's unusual about this, or people who are funding these projects, maybe they've never done it before. But over time, as we build credibility, and the organizations I just mentioned, whether they're businesses or foundations, are recognizable brands. Once you have support from some of those groups, it helps you leverage other funds. Now, all three of our projects were helmed by people who are very experienced journalists. Our path has been a little bit different than Concord, and thanks, Steve, for the kudos. We've had veteran workers carved away from the daily grind for a year or more to focus on sustained work in a very particular subject. I mentioned Beyond the Stigma, and Roberta Baker, who was here for year two, she's sitting out in the audience today, of Silver Linings, spent a good 9 or 10 months. She came into the project halfway through, and Gretchen Grosky had started before that. And I've watched these reporters become experts in their subject matter and trusted by the community to the point where when these projects end, it's difficult. We have people calling saying, hey, where's your Solutions Journal? Where's Roberta Baker now? Where are these stories? Because they continue, and we've sustained them, but that's one of the challenges of working on these projects. And after Silver Linings, we had Beyond the Stigma for a couple of years, and What's Working is our latest project, and that's focusing on workforce solutions. Now, this one's interesting. The pandemic kind of upended this project, because the original point of the project was, okay, in New Hampshire, for 5 years before this project started in 2017, 2018, had an unemployment rate less than 5%. It was about 2.5%, 2.9%. About midway through the project, we had the pandemic, and all of a sudden we're looking at unemployment of 16, 17%. So, the story had to change. Mike Kuzno, who's with us today, took a little breather, and then he talked about, okay, what's the story now? The story now is all the people who are unemployed. How is the state going to bring funds, to all these people who are on unemployment right now, and the restaurants, all the different things that were changing in the workforce. Of course, right now we're back to where we were. We're back to 2.5% unemployment, and actually even a more pronounced version of the problems that we had. And all along the way, we've been, following that. And a good example of the impact of these stories, Mike was talking to, and it's also a good example of how small things, small conversations can turn into big stories, talking to a neighbor who was working remotely, and she worked for a company in Massachusetts, and she was talking about whether she was going to be taxed on that income from Massachusetts. She didn't think she was going to be. Wrong. Massachusetts had passed an emergency measure where they were basically just taxing people at the same level as if they were working in Massachusetts, and this ended up becoming a legal battle. Then went all the way to the Supreme Court. And it's a story that wouldn't have been told if we didn't have somebody focusing on this particular subject. It was actually a quiet, and even the Boston media didn't even see this because it just kind of sailed through. And these are the types of stories that are important that we don't have otherwise, and that's what I really want to drive home here. Our model has been taking a reporter, putting them on just this subject for a year or more, and they're not going to work on anything except these important projects. And by doing that sustained spotlight on something, we come up with solutions and things that people hadn't seen, and it also brings this depth of expertise, as I mentioned with Sean, after these projects are done. And it increases the level of expertise in the newsroom. It also brings people, the kind of enterprise investigative work that they're used to seeing, traditionally. And big media have always been able to do this, right? New York Times cut somebody off for a year or two, work on an investigation. It's much harder for community papers to do this. This enables us to do that. I want to talk a little bit about the funders before I go. In the 5 years that we've been working on these projects, there's never been an issue with a funder trying to influence the coverage in any way. Groups like the Endowment have been very helpful in providing expertise, telling us about potential stories. I know the reporters have worked with people who are funders who might have some ideas for things we might be looking at, but nobody's tried to say, do this, do that. And I think part of that's because of the nature of the subjects we're looking at. And the funders understand that they're funding something important, but they're not, it's the traditional, I'm buying an ad, can I buy a story? That kind of thing. And I think that's been very important, but every time I've been at one of these events or been on a panel, that question always comes up. And the answer has always been the same for us. It hasn't been an issue. And I think because going in, you have good conversations with the people you're working with, and they're understanding what you're doing. And it's a little bit more difficult when you're dealing with entities that have never done this before. But over time, I think we're building that credibility, and it's getting easier. Thanks so much.
Hello, how's everyone doing today? Good, great, I'm glad you all are here. My name is Daniela Ali. I'm the Spanish News Managing Editor at New Hampshire Public Radio. I lead Que Hay de Nuevo New Hampshire, which means what's new in New Hampshire. We produce bilingual stories and news in Spanish, and I just want to take you through how we created this project and what sustained it. So as Lauren referenced as well, in March 2020, we saw a lot more people turn to local news to answer and contextualize the questions we had. What's this virus? What does this mean for our daily lives? And we know this because we saw our web and radio traffic shoot up. And while, of course, the pandemic is global in nature, a lot of the changes that happen are on the local level, and that's what we need to understand in our day-to-day lives. But a fundamental question we had then, and that I think a lot of news organizations had, was what about communities for whom English isn't their first language? Where are they getting their information? Where are those sources of information? If our lives are changing as much as they were, how are people ensuring that they are best informed to make safe decisions for themselves? So a couple of contexts then is that Spanish is the second most spoken language in New Hampshire. But at this critical time in March of 2020, there wasn't news about New Hampshire-specific changes. There wasn't one dedicated outlet to doing that. Sure, we have, Boston-centric outlets. We have Univision, Telemundo, whatever. Great, you can have national context, but what about here? What's Governor Sununu deciding? What are we going to do about X, Y, or Z? What are these funds like? And so in New Hampshire, too, to add to that context is that we have, according to migration policy, about 26,000 adults spoke Spanish in New Hampshire in 2019. About 11,000 said they have limited English proficiency. And while not every single Latino person speaks Spanish, that community continues to grow in the state. And we've seen that in our 2020 census. So at the core of this question, right, is how are we getting information to people? What languages aren't being maybe represented in that? Is the core question of providing critical information in an uncertain time. As a public media institution, we really need to be doing that to serve all of the public, all of our communities. And so ultimately, we were able to answer that question with input and conversations with community leaders here in New Hampshire, and we landed on creating a Spanish newscast that we would send through WhatsApp, which is, I think, the most popular messaging platform in the world. And you can send multimedia, you can send audio, you can send video. So we basically take our local English newscast. So if you're turning on 89.1, 91.3, you might hear Ray Ganley in the morning giving that. We basically took that, translate it into Spanish, record that audio, and share it on group lists on WhatsApp, and include a few of the top headlines in the message. So we have a little text message. You can grab a flyer later that you can actually see what that looks like. And in our first year, we were heavily focused on COVID information. So what's happening, what are the updates, where can you get vaccines, how do you sign up, where can you get tested, all those kinds of things that we were all looking for at that time, and ensuring that this got out to, as I mentioned, a community that is very much a part of our public. 2 years later, that kind of, obviously the pandemic is still here with us, and we continue reporting on that. We've also added a Report for America core member, so our reporting in Spanish has increased. We've got bilingual stories, original reporting, in addition to the daily news that just informs our day-to-day lives. So I think from there, I just want to highlight three big things to underscore is how did this happen? How was this sustained? building trust and relationships with the Spanish-speaking community, Latino community here, and then commitment to trying new things and products and the investment to make that happen. So we wanted to have a product that was responsive to people, so responsive to actual needs. From my previous reporting experience, I knew a lot of Spanish speakers had no idea what NHPR was. So for us to say, well, we'll just translate our COVID blog, we'll just direct people to our website, that was going to be unrealistic. People were not going to come to a place that they had no idea about, and that's what community leaders told us too. But I also knew that people are on WhatsApp. I've texted sources on WhatsApp. People are on it. So what if we put something there? And through like a collaboration with other coworkers, we decided, well, let's do our English newscast. Let's do it that way. That'll be most accessible, so you can listen to it. Maybe you're driving. Maybe So we decided to do that. And when we floated that idea to community leaders that we were talking with, they were like, "Great, that works. Definitely don't translate your COVID blog. Definitely do this." Awesome. So that was actually being able to respond to that. And it might seem really odd at first, though, right? It's like, but you're a radio station. Why aren't you directing people to tune into the radio station? Why aren't you tuning people in to go to nhpr.org? And that's, I think, where that commitment to trying new things and new products comes in, is that we took a chance, and we also made investments, and we found grants, and we found donors who wanted to support this different way of providing news and information to people in our community. And our team has grown, as I mentioned. We have a Report for America core member. I edit the team. We have a part-time producer who's actually based in Ecuador. She was a Northeastern graduate. So one of the great benefits of remote work that we reap. And just like in this last minute here, here's some outcomes that we've seen as a result of this work that started in March of 2020, April 2020. We have 344 people subscribed on our WhatsApp group. We have about 1,000 unique page views monthly on nhpr.org/noticias and more than 330 followers on Facebook. And while these may not seem like the most enormous numbers, we're in year 2. I think we're really trying to embody a model that is moving at the speed of trust and building relationships with people, being committed to broadening and deepening those in the community. And just to share some tidbits of audience feedback we've gotten, we appreciate you every day. Thanks for the moving interviews and stories. Continue this lovely and interesting work. Thanks for your efforts to bring us this news. We've also been able to share information to connect people with English classes. People have asked us about, hey, I'm moving to Nashua. Where can I learn about housing here? So that's an outcome there. And then one other outcome that I will share briefly is that when KI started, we had a small group of media members from the Granite State News Collaborative, and as I mentioned, community leaders meet to get KI launched, to spread the word. We're still meeting 2 years later, and with a clear purpose of increasing news availability in Spanish by producing content that the Latino community in New Hampshire needs, while building connection and understanding between Latinos and in the broader community. And so that, again, like this effort has continued to have an impact not just at NHPR, but hopefully across the state as we've been able to build that. And so we're coming up with different ideas. We have a Flavors of Our Neighbors series, which highlighted Latino restaurant owners in the state. Keene Sentinel, Concord Monitor, New Hampshire Business Review shared some of those stories. And I think just, we'll continue to have those kinds of next steps to develop ideas both as a group, to continue community information needs assessment with KI, and to just continue developing these stories. And I think, all of our audiences have enjoyed them from what I've seen, and it's been so rewarding to get messages like the ones I've just referenced, where it's like, okay, people see this work, they appreciate it, and it's been enabled by us taking a risk and donors believing in what we're trying to do. So we're excited to continue that work, and I hope this is an example of something that can occur when all the right forces kind of meld together. So thanks so much for your time.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and I want to express my appreciation for the folks that spoke before me. Some of what you'll hear is kind of shared experience with what these folks have done in their work. I had the good fortune recently of going through the local media association's lab for journalism funding. Actually, Steve was part of the group. The focus of this lab was to look at ways that we could increase or improve our journalism in key areas that are critical to our readership, and to do so in partnership with philanthropies and donors and those who kind of aligned with us in terms of the importance of local journalism. At the core of this work is the concept of unity of purpose, which is a phrase that was first used by a gentleman named Larry Lee. He's the publisher of the Sacramento Observer, which is a small news organization. And I think they're up to 6 journalists, but they started with 2, and he did so aligning his work with what the community saw as important. Frank Mungem, who is the Chief Innovation Officer for the LMA, wrote that news organizations and funders can align around community needs and can leverage 3 value propositions that local news organizations possess. The first is audience reach. Most, if not all, of the news organizations gathered here today are dominant means of communications in their respective markets between print or digital or social media. Being a trusted messenger. Despite the low regard that national media is held these days, that is not the case locally. People know our journalists, people trust our journalists, and that is a very important aspect of what we do. And then a track record of community service. We've been around since 1799. That's a long time to be doing what we've been doing. There are a lot of news organizations in New Hampshire that have been around a great amount of time, and I think this is one of those times in which we can refer to legacy news organizations in a positive way. Of late, linking the priorities of various philanthropic organizations with the local missions of news organizations has accelerated. But there are important steps along the way that need to be taken to solidify these relationships. First of all, listening to community is paramount. You heard Steve talk a little bit about that. We may all have a sense of a major challenge faced by a given community, but until we get out there and kind of test that to see if in fact that is true, we're acting only on gut. If there is a need that a news organization is not currently addressing or not doing so in a solutions-oriented manner, then we are compelled to suggest a means to do that. Often this is in the form of a lab, which is not so much an experiment, but a place to gather all sorts of resources to tackle a local issue. That would include dedicated journalists focused on that issue. That would include the use of data. And it would also include the measurement of our impact. And that's the third piece, measuring impact. We can do this work, but its impact needs to be more than anecdotal. Is our journalism moving the needle toward improving a community need? Are there data that support this funding? Are we looking for solutions that may have to come from outside of the community? And are we reaching underserved audiences, which I think is a very critical aspect of this. If we're going to do this work, we have to recognize that we don't get to everybody, but we should try to get to more people. So this led to the formation of the Monadnock Region Health Reporting Lab. We started by going out into the community and testing our hypothesis that the Monadnock region has a real challenge in terms of healthcare access, the cost of care, and the depth of care. We thought those were the cases, but we really felt the need to go out and confirm that. So we did more than 30 listening sessions in the community asking that question. What do you think is the biggest challenge in terms of healthcare in this region? We talked to medical professionals, we talked to patients, we talked to business leaders, insurance brokers, nonprofit leaders, and there was a consensus built around those 3 items. And so, you know, kind of with that as confirmation, we started work on building out what this lab should look like. And our lab includes a dedicated reporter. It includes a budget for freelance editing and reporting. It includes some travel because we're pretty certain that to find solutions to some of these problems, we're not going to find them necessarily locally. And I think it's really important that we go out and if we're going to do this work, we bring back you know, potential solutions for these critical local issues. So we've been pitching this concept to potential stakeholders, local donors, foundations, and philanthropies. It's going to take a while. Our budget for this is $86,000 a year for 3 years. It's going to take 3 years, I think, to firmly implant this into our operation. We're hopeful. We've had some initial success, but we have a long way to go. Some observations that I would make as part of this process, it's a really affirming process. It is one in which you find out how important local news is to people, how important the local news institution is to delivering that information, and how gratifying it is to hear just how in lockstep folks are with our mission and what we're trying to do. It has me thinking about this approach as being a potential model for other ways to tackle critical issues in each community. It may not be that we can raise money for each one of these, but the concept of really dedicating resources and time and energy to tackling these really critical core issues that all of our communities face in some regard or another, it strikes me as having real potential and something to pay attention to. We would appreciate anyone that wants to go on that journey with us. It's really important. We're at a very important point in local news coverage these days, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Hello, thank you to all of the partners that made this event happen today, and for the funders and potential funders here in the room to learn more about how you can support the journalism work going on in New Hampshire. My name is Julie Hershan-Hart, and I'm the co-editor for the Laconia Daily Sun. Our work with grant funding for journalism started with a conversation with the Endowment for Health, who you've heard a lot about already today. They approached us to come up with a way that we could examine civic discourse and social determinants of health throughout New Hampshire, which launched into a solutions journalism project, which allowed us to hire a full-time solutions reporter who's here with us today, Roberta Baker. But it did so much more than that. It introduced solutions journalism to our entire newsroom, and offered training for all of our reporters to really dig deep and learn about the importance and how solutions journalism can elevate their reporting and help build trust within the community. It also, the grant introduced us to another partner you've heard about today, the Solutions Journalism Network, who helped us with this training and also helped us think outside the box and look at what other ways that we could innovate and bring a new perspective to our newsroom. And part of the grant that we received from the endowment was to put on an event, which was something that we had never done before. And so with the partnership of the Solutions Journalism Network, we held an event for letter writers to our paper to examine civic discourse in the Lakes region. And we really learned that events are a wonderful way to engage with our readers, and it helped us engage with our readers in a new way. And this led us through a journey into our next project, which was funded through a private family grant with the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, which was to work with youth in a Voices project that was a series of articles that culminated in an event to examine the impact that the pandemic had had on youth in schools as well as other places in the community. And this has really shown us that our partners have opened many doors for us throughout the state and has helped us build a rapport with our community and build trust. Okay. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. My name is Johnny Bassett. I'm the data and journalism editor for the Granite State News Collaborative. I was born and raised in Canterbury, just north of here. And today I'm going to talk to you about the importance of data journalism here in New Hampshire. So data journalism is a bit of a hand-wavy term, but what I mean in particular is stories that really depend on the use of graphs, maps, and data to tell that story. That might have originated the story, or it's what drives it through to the end. And so I want to leave you with three main points here about data journalism. The first is that it's critical to some of the most important stories that we're telling today. The second is that it can be resource intensive. But the third is that despite this cost, we think that it's absolutely worth the investment. And we think there's a lot of great potential here for newsrooms around the state that are starting to invest in data journalism and need support to take it the rest of the way. So first, what is so special about data journalism and why am I talking about it? So we think it's so important because it makes us into more effective reporters. It gives the reporters access to information, to huge amounts of information that's sitting there in archives that otherwise they wouldn't be able to engage with. If you don't have the tools, if you can't open Excel, you can't open an Excel spreadsheet. And that's a huge amount of information that's sitting there waiting to be analyzed. The second is that it gives the readers that access to the information. Because if it can't go through the reporter, then the readers are never going to get it either. And it gives the readers this context and detail that they're increasingly starting to rely on. So of course, many stories are excellent without data journalism. And a lot of the stories that have been referenced here today, that's traditional journalism, and it continues to be invaluable. But there are some stories, and these are often stories that shed light on systemic issues across the entire state or across the entire country, and these are data-driven. And there's no better example of that than COVID. So now in anything that gets written about COVID, the readers are looking for statistics, graphs, percentages. This is the kind of currency that now the COVID stories are built on. And every outlet here knows that, and they've made some really incredible investments. And folks here have built some incredible tools that I'm sure we've all used. And the state government knows that readers now demand this. They've been pumping out a lot of really cleaned up, helpful data for us to all use and for the outlets to use. And this has made it easy for outlets to build all these incredible tools. If the state hadn't been providing it, if reporters weren't keen to get involved and learn these new skills, it wouldn't have been possible. The problem, though, is that, of course, data journalism isn't always that easy, and sometimes it requires extra resources. So for COVID, remember that there was a state website. There is still a state website that makes it really easy to engage with all this. But for many topics, many of the topics that we're all talking about right now, there are no such beautiful websites. So I do this for the collaborative. I wear many hats, but I do this for the collaborative. And I have spent many, many months rooting around looking for random data sets that would be key to unlocking some story for a reporter. And that's been on a bunch of different topics, about urban heat islands, about broadband internet coverage in the state, about urban poverty, college enrollments, lead poisoning. For all of these, there is some data hidden somewhere, but it's often hard to know where that is, and you have to know the right people to ask. All these traditional reporting skills that then get you to the data, and then you need the tools to use it. So sometimes I find that data, sometimes I don't, and that is very depressing. But sometimes that's how it goes. Sometimes the data doesn't exist. New Hampshire is not great overall at the accessibility to public data. But reporters just now are learning how to find the data that exists there, and that's what we're trying to support. And of course, once you find that data, you have to have the technical skills to know how to engage with it. And some of these involve heavier lifts than others. But I'll give you an example. So over the last couple months, I've been looking for data on the housing market in the state, focusing in Manchester, where we've been doing some reporting previously I'll tell you about. So finding the data, finding the websites that this data existed on, that took 30 minutes. That was easy. I felt like a champion. But it has taken months to download that information from state websites, state and city websites, and it's taken months to then make that information ready for a reporter to use, because it requires a lot of analysis to make it legible to a human who does not think too much in terms of the coding and stuff that I've been working with. So it has taken months to make those 2.2 million points of data legible to the editor. But once it is there, that is 2.2 million data points that they otherwise would never have been able to engage with. And they're going to be able to tell a story from that they wouldn't have access to previously. So despite these issues, we already know that the investment in data journalism is worthwhile, because we've already had some successes in this. And I want to tell you about one project in particular, and it shows how powerful just a little bit of data journalism can be, and how great the potential, therefore, is if there's a little bit of data journalism literacy in newsrooms across the state. And this is the Invisible Walls series that has gone out through a lot of the outlets that are here today. So this project began with a simple question, and it was, why are so many of Manchester's socioeconomic issues concentrated in Center City? And so I went and talked to experts, and they all said that we should be looking at zoning, and I should be looking for historical data on zoning. I asked the city, they don't have that data. I got a little sad, but then Melanie gave me a pep talk, and we started doing actual data journalism. And so what we did is we decided to make our own data sets. And so to do that, I used some mapping software, and I got some historical data, paper maps from the city showing their zoning boundaries going back to 1929. I digitized them, and then I basically just stacked them on top of each other and started looking for patterns. And doing that did not require a PhD in geography. Any journalist could have done it with access to this free software and just a couple days of training. But what I found was that zoning over the years had helped concentrate low-income housing in that one part of the city, and had been doing that consistently for 100 years. So armed with this piece of information, Melanie and I started talking to some of the editors in this room and started to think about how we could turn this into an actual series. Because a story is not a data point. A story needs something around it that makes it actually accessible, and that's where traditional journalism comes in. And so what I'm proud to say that over a couple months, we turned that simple piece of analysis into one of the most successful stories that the collaborative has run to date. It ran in newspapers across the state. We put out a 4-part series that has since been added to, NHPR got involved, and they put out, Daniela was on top of that and put out an excellent piece there. And within a week of that story coming out, we were contacted by the mayor's office and by several aldermen who wanted to know more about what we had found, because they thought this might help them revise the zoning and building codes, which are in the process of doing now. And it produced other leads, which then, with additional data analysis, has spun off all of these other stories. And we're working with the partners on this new set of stories that, now that we have this cookbook, per se, of how to do this, where we can apply it elsewhere in the state. Because zoning is, of course, not limited to Manchester. The problems that we see in Manchester are not limited here. To different degrees, they're present everywhere. And now that we have some of these tools, we can apply them. We're also trying to share these methodologies and the data sets through the data library, which is a part of our website where we're now sharing these data sets and the methodologies publicly, free for download there. So wrapping up here, I think data journalism gives us a lot to be excited about with journalism in New Hampshire, both at the collaborative and at all of the outlets here that are making the investment. Data journalism is a broad field, and of course I've only described the little bit that we're doing at the collaborative. But since the start of COVID, we've learned that data journalism is very important to the readers and very important to us as we're all trying to figure out what's going on across our state. And the problem that we're trying to overcome now is that data journalism does require a bit of an upfront investment, and that can be difficult for some outlets. However, we absolutely think it's worth the investment. And now more than ever, we think we need more data journalists across the state who are able to use these skills and tap into the wealth of knowledge that's sitting there waiting to be assessed. Thank you very much.
Hi,
Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Berry, a founding board member for the Granite State News Collaborative. Our executive director, Melanie Plenda, very much wanted to be here, but because of, and I quote, stupid COVID, she could not and sends her regrets, and we also wish her a very speedy recovery. So it was March 2020, just as our communities needed us most. It was when the journalism industry in New Hampshire was hit the hardest. The first pandemic waves had a crushing impact on newsrooms across the state, but we wouldn't and we couldn't give up. Our communities needed us, and we knew it. Within an hour of a small group of collaborative partners deciding to work together to cover the pandemic, we had all 20 media, community, and educational partners in agreement, and we'd stood up an infrastructure to share all partner stories on the pandemic and its impacts with each other for distribution. In addition to managing the coordinated coverage, the collaborative as an organization put to work its team of investigative freelance reporters, many of whom were laid off and furloughed staff of partners, filling in coverage gaps by producing statewide, in-depth, solutions-focused stories, packages, and series that all of our partners could distribute across any platform and out to their communities. The impacts of our efforts were almost immediate. We soon realized that rather than having one story live and die in one corner of the state, through our network it could live and grow legs, potentially reaching more than 3.8 million people through print, online, and broadcast journalism. Together, in just the first 10 months of the pandemic, we shared more than 1,700 stories with our readers, viewers, and listeners that they otherwise wouldn't have accessed. Of those, collaborative freelancers produced more than 500. Together, we were able to help start a digital public affairs show with New Hampshire PBS and help NHPR with the first ever Spanish news broadcast in New Hampshire, as you've heard about. And then as the 2020 election came into view, we expanded our efforts and worked together to produce stories that would dispel misinformation and, just as important, provide Granite Staters with trusted information on the issues as well as the facts that they needed to feel safe, secure, and confident in voting. We even coordinated coverage of the election itself, something that hadn't happened in our state before. So how does it work? The collaborative SWAT team of investigative freelancers is able to take on the time and resource-intensive work that outlets don't always have the capacity to produce themselves. Yet these are the kinds of in-depth, investigative, and solutions-focused stories that our communities need most in order to create the changes they want to see in our state. Because we're working together and because of generous philanthropic and public support, as part of our Race and Equity Initiative, for example, we've been able to launch ambitious, solutions-focused investigative series on the effects of exclusionary zoning practices and possible solutions, which you've heard about, the impacts and ramifications of the Divisive Concepts Law, the treatment of Indigenous people in New Hampshire, equity in New Hampshire education, environmental justice, and access to civic engagement, to name just a few. We've also been able to highlight and amplify the voices of our communities of color in partnership with these communities through initiatives including the Common Ground Initiative, Our Story NH, and Flavors of Our Neighbors. These stories have already had community impact. Anthony Payton, the author and co-producer of the Common Ground Initiative, who's with us here today, reports that he's received dozens of emails thanking him for his work in trying to bridge understanding between all of our communities in New Hampshire. The work of our Report for America reporter, Jenny Whitten, on the treatment of Indigenous communities shook loose a logjam that had prevented members of the New Hampshire Commission on Native American Affairs from officially doing their work. And within 24 hours of publishing the first story in our Invisible Walls series, 2 aldermen and the entire planning department in Manchester wanted to meet with Johnny, our data reporter, to learn and discuss the issues more. We're doing work that would not be done otherwise. We've heard this time and again from editors within our partnership and from public feedback as well. We've become a real unified force for trusted information, and we're not done yet. We're going to continue our focus on race and equity while expanding our collective coverage to include other vital issues that impact our communities. With collaborative partners, we're launching a pilot program to train students and members of the public to cover municipal meetings. Not only will this increase civic engagement, but with the help of experienced collaborative editors, we hope the pilot program will increase the capacity of local news outlets to cover important local debates and decisions. We've also added college news outlets to our partnership in an effort to bring vital information to an often overlooked community in our state. In a recent meeting with one of these new partners, Max Scheinblum, the editor of The New Hampshire at UNH, he summed up what all this work has been and always will be about. He said, "The whole state wins when we're all working together." One thing is clear from the past 3 years: when we harness the collective energy and will of community, business, higher education, philanthropic, and journalism leaders, it makes a difference. It has an impact, and there's nothing we can't do together. Thank you.
I'm going to ask folks to come back. I know it's so wonderful to be in the company of others and to have the opportunity to visit with one another. We have built in some networking time towards the end of the program today, so I invite you to eat at your spot now. Hopefully everyone has grabbed a boxed lunch. And there are recycling bags. The clear plastic bags are to recycle. The dark plastic bags are for trash. I can't tell you any more than that, but thank you for doing your part. I want to say also thank you to our funders panel who are here today to talk to us. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, Leah, Karen, and Katie, in that order, since that's the order we're sitting in here, and to tell us a little bit about how do you define news philanthropy? How did you get started in this work? Does that sound good? You want to jump in, Leah?
Sounds great. I'd be happy to. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Leah Todd Lynn, and I'm a collaborative manager with a national nonprofit group called the Solutions Journalism Network. But I am very privileged to live in Lebanon, New Hampshire, just about an hour from here. We have a lot of Lebanon representation in the front row, so be careful. And I got started in journalism because of my passion for community and informed community. Telling stories, staying curious, learning about the experiences of people who were very different from me. I think journalism, when it's done well, really does that. It builds community across differences. And when it comes to my involvement in philanthropy and my involvement in nonprofits, I was working at a newspaper in Wyoming, the Casper Star-Tribune, and I just started to feel as a reporter that there was really something missing in the way that I was doing news at the time. And it came out of a frustration that when all that we do is report day in and day out of what's going wrong, and I was an education reporter, so at the time, even then, there were a lot of challenges in local schools. And I just felt like it was my responsibility to also start asking, well, what can we learn from school districts that are doing something right or trying something different? And can't we tell rigorous stories that are just as important, just as well read, and just as well received about those ideas of innovation and progress that are being made, in addition to the stories that we often see in the headlines, which are not as positive. So that was sort of my entree into solutions journalism. I then went on to the Seattle Times, where I was an education reporter at one of the first community-funded labs at the Seattle Times in 2014 and 2015. And then in 2016, I started working for the Solutions Journalism Network, and I've been with them ever since.
Hi, my name's Karen Ager. I'm the communications director at the New Hampshire Endowment for Health. And my entree into this work began almost a decade ago when our board approved a new strategic plan and determined that we really needed to raise awareness out in the public arena about several of the issues we care deeply about. So I got the green light to go forth and forge underwritten coverage partnerships with the media, which was a thrill, but I also begged at the time for a little more time to talk to other philanthropies around the country about how they had forged media partnerships. I was also thinking really long and hard about the need, obviously, for editorial independence and how we would do that and still be happy with the coverage on complex social issues. And when I had heard about the Solutions Journalism Network at a national conference, you know, I got pinged inside and a light bulb went off, feeling like this really does appear to be a very rigorous form of investigative reporting that is hard-hitting and critical thinking, and also can move beyond traditional problem-based reporting to examine attempts to solve problems. And so that's how we ended up getting into this work.
That's great. And I'm Katie Merrow, Vice President of Community Impact at the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. And I don't think we got started in news philanthropy. I think we're just working in community. And the foundation has always taken a systems approach. If you think of the problems before our communities, before all of us right now, they're complex, and there's not a single one that doesn't require local understanding, engagement of local folks, and action by a multitude of partners and actors on the ground. And you can't have that if people don't have awareness of the issue, understanding of it, and a way, you know, understanding and connection to each other around it, and connection to the issue and understanding of how they might engage. So community news, community journalism provides that. And there is no other entity, that other function that we have to provide that. And so for us, it really was a natural extension of the way we work in community. I will just say two other things, though, two other points that make it critical right now is, you know, none of us has the scale to fix all these problems, right? And the journalism and everything I've just described is very high leverage because it gives people information and understanding to act, and many people. It's also something where we need to act right now because this system still exists in crisis, under threat, and somewhat, you know, very challenged, as folks have said, but this system of local journalism is there. If we let it die and then rebuild it, that will take far more resources, and we will lose, you know, the actions we need at a very critical time. So we also, in our investments, in any grant we make, we look at high leverage, and is there a moment in time where investment makes a difference? So I would say that to all the business folks in the room. This is a high leverage, time-sensitive investment. And that was also compelling to us.
Thank you. I'm curious, for both Katie and Karen, how hard was it to convince your organization to make investments in community news philanthropy, and how did you convince them to do that?
It wasn't hard at all. I think we barreled into it without enough data. So again, I was happy to have bought some more time to try to explore what would be an approach where we felt, you know, the method of reporting would allow us to step away behind that editorial firewall and let the process run as it should and has to. So, you know, in our case, our board was asking questions along the lines of, well, tell us, you know, how we're going to be able to you know, build this narrative of what we want to tell for healthy aging. So I made several presentations to our board along the lines of, let's talk about what editorial independence is and why it's the absolute baseline ticket to entry with news outlets, and just making sure the board had our back, you know, making sure everyone understood this is not buying a journalist in our pocket by any means. And while we've had great relationships to check in and see how it's going, we've been able to invite the journalists on these coverage projects to attend certain convenings or to offer to connect them with certain subject matter experts. That's where we stepped back. And so for our board, it was just ensuring that everyone understood that. And then there were some other questions, but we could maybe get into that later. Generally, we didn't have any trouble convincing our board to do underwritten coverage, but we took several months to explain to them, what is solutions journalism, why is it different, when are we going to create our terms of agreement, and when are we going to step back, such that we're reading about you know, each article as it comes out. We had no advanced knowledge of what was going to be covered or when. We would generally have you know, carved out a percentage of the coverage we expected, And we had some specificity of the terms of agreement. We could always be more specific. But generally, that was it. And then the process led itself, and we stepped out of it.
That's great. And I also, Karen got a shout out earlier, and I want to call out Karen's leadership at the endowment around solutions journalism in the state. Has been a wonderful partner, and we've learned a lot from you in the course of this. Like Karen, it wasn't an effort it wasn't a challenge to convince anyone. It really was a natural extension. The Charitable Foundation has always had deep investment in civic engagement and commitment to it. This is a part of that. If anything, we've been, as we look at our challenges in the state now and how this foundation can be most helpful, we're increasing our commitment to civic health, to racial equity, and elevating voices of those who are facing the challenges that we're all working on. And so I'd say this becomes more important in that, with that elevation of those priorities. If anything, it's a matter of just prioritization. As a community foundation, we fund broadly, so we don't have huge scale to fix everything. And so this is one piece of what we do, and will continue to be an important piece, but we also are funding across a lot of needs. And so that's just the balancing act we always have to address.
Thank you. Leah, we've had a number of people here talk about solutions journalism, and I realize that we skipped the step of defining that up front. So I'm hoping that you can do that for us so that we can then continue to talk about it.
Sure. And I should say I fully endorse all of the descriptions of solutions journalism that have happened here this morning, so I think many people in this room could define it better than I could. But for what it's worth, our definition of solutions journalism is that it's rigorous reporting on the responses to social problems, in addition to covering and reporting on the problems themselves, which everyone in this room still does and still should do. And so when we look at a solutions-focused story, we look for 4 elements. This is from our perspective over the years. We've kind of developed this framework. We look for meaningful detail about a response to a problem. Does it really give the audience member a sense of how it works, really, and not just glossing over any of the details? We look for evidence about whether or not this response was effective, how effective, and how do we know? We look for insights. What can other communities learn from what this one approach tried in a certain place, whether that's your own community or, like we've been hearing today, from a community farther away? And then lastly, we look for limitations. So this is what really makes it journalism. What are the drawbacks? What are the unintended consequences? What do the credible skeptics or the critics say? What was tough about getting to this point? So those are the 4 qualities that, regardless of how long the story is, whether it's a television story or a radio story, those are the 4 elements that we think really make solutions journalism strong.
Thank you so much. So Katie, I'm curious to know, and I want to let everyone here know that there will be time for your own questions. So be thinking about what you'd like to ask the panel as well. But I'm curious to know, as a grant maker, how funding community news advances engagement at the foundation in all of the other issues that your funders care about.
Right, it's a great question. I think it's integral, as I say. If, pick your issue. Childcare to help meet all your workforce needs, or the opioid crisis that we've been facing, or the threats to K through 12 public education in so many of our communities, or what's happening in terms of the environment and access to natural resources in the state. Whatever it is, having that understanding of the issue and increasing the number of people engaged in coming to that issue and connecting with each other around it, there is no problem in front of us that is not helped by that. And so it's that we have donors who may be interested in journalism per se, and donors who care about substance use, who are reading all their information's coming from the paper, and they want to do something. So, in terms of impact, we've seen areas where the journalism, our greatest increases in contributions to substance use in recent years have happened through the opioid crisis, because donors know and see the challenge and are moved to act. And then we're able to bring resources to not just the journalism, but more importantly, the folks working in community on those issues. So it's relevant for any issue. it drives engagement because people need information and a way into the issue to address it. So I guess that's how I'd say that.
But ask the same question of Karen. When the endowment chooses priority areas for grant making, how does this work that you're doing in solutions journalism fit into and help to add some power to the work that you're already doing at the endowment?
Sure. Well, how the endowment has started funding has been more issue-based coverage. How it's integral to all of our work, I think a great example is Roberta Baker's work at the Laconia Daily Sun with the Sunshine Project. We approached the Sun very much interested in this notion of civil and civic discourse. The Sun was interested in that, plus additional social determinants of health and everything from economic vitality of their region to, you know, access to health care and children's mental health. So by the end of the series, and Roberta has been prolific with it, at least with the end of our funding of it, I gather it's still going on in various forms. The series had touched on every single one of our priority areas, such that our community partners who might be working in children's mental health were like, wow, did you see that? Best article ever, you know, best coverage I've ever seen on the topic of my expertise. That wasn't actually what we walked in the door to fund. But so this is a really key point. You know, when a funder and a news outlet work together, you really need to look for the sweet spot. It may not be 100% of what you want covered. The news outlet's going to have things they're interested in, and it needs to be a respectful dance and negotiation to try to find the sweet spot, and then to say, okay, well, we'll fund it even though you want to cover other things that maybe wasn't what we approached you about. But at the end of the day, everything builds on itself, and you know, it makes an impact in the community. Last thing I'll say is just that now that we have several years of a track record funding issue-based coverage in partnership with some of our news outlets, our leadership and board really understand that providing general capacity building and operating support to sustain the practice of solutions journalism specifically, and just to make sure we have a healthy news ecosystem, is as, if not more important than the issue-based coverage we started out funding.
And Laura, could I add just one other thing? Because I think the interest in this work and the growing of it in New Hampshire has been happening for a number of years. But with the current threats to, when you're speaking of civic engagement, we have to name the threats to democracy that we're seeing, not just in the country, but here in New Hampshire, you know, everywhere. And so this only becomes more important, and especially at the local level, connecting people and building understanding around issues is just a critical antidote to that, and to strengthen the foundation that will help us, you know, stay where we need to be in terms of that.
We heard during the lightning talks, as we called them, examples of organizations, not just the generous foundations who are up here, but individual businesses and private individuals who are interested in funding journalism. And Leah, I was wondering if you could say something about what you think other funders, other than those who have dedicated staff working on this issue, what can they learn from it? Or even how could somebody get started in this work if they were interested in funding community news?
That's a great question. And like I mentioned, I'm based in Lebanon, but my work is national. So I really have the chance to talk to a lot of newsrooms, a lot of news leaders, and a lot of funders, and people who are interested in supporting local news all over the country. And so my message to people out of the state of New Hampshire is always, look at what New Hampshire is doing, with people like Karen who have done the research on how to go about best practices for setting up these sorts of community arrangements, the Charitable Foundation, which has provided a lot of support. So that's my message when I'm speaking and talking to people outside of the state. When I'm in the state, like today, my message is I hope you know what you have here and how special it is with the collaborative, that has grown over the last several years with these funders who have led this conversation, and with this sense of responsibility that I think exists in our state of taking care of one another and taking care of those whose voices have not been as well represented in the news over the last several decades, generations, that we're starting to understand better today. So that's the first message in terms of what can you learn. Be, I think, really heartened by everything that you've heard today. And then also, like Karen mentioned, she called up Tina Rosenberg, my boss and our co-founder at the Solutions Journalism Network, and just had a conversation about how do we begin this sort of community support, public funding for the local news that's so critical to civic engagement and progress on any number of issue areas, regardless of how you're funding or where you're funding. So I'd say talk to one another in this room. That's why I'm so excited that this first event is happening today. And also get in touch with national organizations that are doing this. The Local Media Association has been mentioned today. There's another great set of resources from Media Impact Funders that has done a lot of research around who's funding this sort of work. How do you track impact? What are the metrics that need to go into a grant application in order to support local news? There's some nuance there that a lot of smart people have spent a lot of time thinking about. So there are resources that exist in this state and also nationally for you to start having these conversations. But I think at the base of it all is, having a lunch with Karen or going out to hear more about what Terry at the Keene Sentinel has cooking up next. And that, I think, is the beauty of living in a small state like we do. A lot can happen when you just sit down with someone and start to think about what's possible, what's next, and what's our shared vision, where are the overlaps in our mission.
Yeah, if I could just quickly add to that, I also think it's very important for the funders to keep talking to each other. And a big shout out to my counterpart at the Charitable, Kristen Oliveri, who, we're sharing ideas all the time, and she had questions about some of the underwritten coverage we were doing, but we weren't at the time aware of the Granite State News Collaborative, but the Charitable had been on the ground floor of supporting them. And of course, the endowment has since, over time, had many excellent partnerships with the collaborative. It's finally culminated in being able to provide some operating support for the collaborative. We would not have we probably would have known who they were eventually, but I think talking to other funders helps us leverage and understand, well, what's the value you're getting from supporting that organization? And I guess I should know about them. And so for all the funders in the room, I would encourage us to continue talking about ways in which we can support the media. And of course, always willing to talk to media outlets as well about what their needs are.
Thank you for that. And thinking about, because there are a number of journalists in the room, as we know, because journalism relies on trust and integrity, most importantly, maybe independence. We heard a couple of people earlier talk about that relationship between the news and the funding. And Karen, you touched on this as well. I'm curious to know how we could all do a better job of, those of us who work in the news, of how to explain the need for editorial independence to potential funders. And also, if you could tell us a story about a situation where that may have been a challenge, either on the side of your board and the leadership of your organization, or on the part of the news outlet.
Do you want me to go first, or?
Go ahead, Karen.
It's never been a problem on editorial independence. Although, Mike Cody and Adam Hershan, let us know if you felt like we ever crossed the line. We always have said, please let us know. Slap our hand, it's okay. Hopefully we haven't. We've taken that very seriously. How to explain that to other funders? I've heard other news outlets saying that they'll just walk away from potential funders if they feel that's going to be a problem. And that might be the best approach, and that might be hard to do, but at the end of the day, if you feel like they want to dictate and control it, that would be difficult. Have we ever, now this is something in the discussion with national philanthropies about how they've done underwritten coverage. I did hear from a funder in Alaska who was very interested in substance use, and they were very much a proponent of the alcohol tax. Well, they underwrote some coverage, and one of the headlines coming out of that coverage was the alcohol tax doesn't work. And they were not happy. So one of the things we told our board is we have to expect that we may not like every headline, and you need to have our back, because we're not going to be asking you to pick up the phone and call and complain about that, nor would we. So those are the rules of engagement. We've never not liked a headline. There might have been 1 or 2 times where we're like, how does that fit? But if we just waited for a little while and let the coverage play out, we would say, oh, okay, we understand that. So we were very cautious about approaching editors and reporters in the middle of a series. Other than like, oh, it's time for us to check in, how's it going? What are we working on? What are you working on? Or did you want to come to this convening? Or can we connect to the reporter, to the subject matter expert? Beyond that, though, we learned about the coverage when it hit the website or the newspaper itself. We didn't have any kind of inside advantage to that, nor did we seek it. So I don't think we had too much of a problem with the board understanding that.
Yeah, I would echo that. To me, this is kind of obvious. I mean, I appreciate the question. I don't want to dismiss it, as some may have it, but we fund all kinds of grantees, and they are independent actors with their own boards and own employees, and their work is independent as it should be. And so this is, for one, that applies here. Second of all, when we're working on an issue, say substance use or early childhood and then child care needs in the state, we fund a range of work on an issue if we're looking at it systemically, including we fund advocacy. And even they're independent advocates, but who will, maybe there is a policy that the state needs and they will be working to advance that. We fund that knowingly. That's their independent choice, but we'll fund on that issue. And we may fund coverage of an issue to increase the understanding, but we're not looking for this to be that. So I guess those are 2 things I would add.
And I would just add, from the newsroom's perspective, there's a long history here of public support for public radio, public support for public television, and advertisers and businesses that have placed ads in local newspapers. So there are some new rules of engagement, I think, that have been described really well here, and lots of best practices around the right subgrant language and the right MOUs and how to have these conversations with this new kind of public support for local news. But I think the basic question has not changed, and there are many, many sectors of our industry and news that have been doing this really well and really responsibly for a long time.
Thank you. I want to make sure that everyone in the room who might have a question gets an opportunity. There will be some networking following closing remarks, so you may want to speak with these folks one-on-one. But Anna is in the corner over there, and Steve is in the corner over here, and they both have microphones, so if you'd like to raise your hand. I see another Anna with a question.
So, speaking to grant makers, I want to sort of hear your answer to a question which is about measurements of success, because a lot of what we're talking about today is not easily quantifiable when we're talking about community engagement and civic engagement and transforming our democracy with important information. Those are very abstract concepts, and it's also really hard to disaggregate, what one particular newspaper reporting is doing to change voter turnout or who shows up at a local meeting. So a lot of the measurements that I've heard today are just eyeballs, and that's something at our organization that also we focus on a lot. But I'm curious to hear from you folks, what social impact metrics or measures of success are you looking for when you get grant applications?
Well, there's what I would call the lower hanging fruit, which is, we forge out a work plan with our media partners that might call for a certain level of productivity on the part of the reporter in the newsroom. So, 36 stories, some of which are long form, some of which are short form. In every case that we funded, the reporters working on our underwritten coverage blew through those measures and far exceeded it. So there are things like that. There's certainly other measures of success that we look for, such as we want the whole newsroom to be trained on solutions journalism, especially if you've got this reporter coming in with what could be perceived as a plum position. And if the whole culture of the newsroom doesn't understand why that reporter's there and what technique they're using, that would be difficult. So we view success as seeing the whole newsroom get training and new knowledge out of this, not just the reporter coming in. We've done things like pre and post opinion polling to see what is the awareness and understanding of an issue before the coverage starts and after. So that's certainly a way to measure. And we don't discount anecdotal information. I know we've heard back, letters to the editor come in remarking on the coverage, or our advocates remark on how that was really a more thoughtful type of coverage than I've ever seen on my issue. Or the reporter is called out saying, you really made a difference for my child. So while those are softer measures, we also take that into consideration.
Yeah, I would say that's exactly right. That's similar for us. And the only thing I would say is don't reach. I mean, to get a grant, you don't have to prove that this is going to save democracy or turn around the opioid crisis. And we wouldn't, no expectation around that. Makes sense of how this kind of coverage fits into work on an issue, which we know if we're talking with you already, but making sure you understand that. And then, like Karen said, there's outputs just as anybody reading. Are you reaching anybody? There's narrative around what you think, anecdotal or narrative description of how you saw the impact of the stories, and scale it to the scale of the grant. If it's a $20,000 grant, nobody expects you to do broad survey polling. You know what I mean? We always want to primarily fund the work in addition to having a way to learn about its impact together with you. So.
I would just add to that there's a checklist in the back of the room that you can grab before you leave that is 22 impact examples that you might not have thought to look for. And this is a list developed by a very smart researcher named Lindsay Green Barber, who has an organization called Impact Architects, and she's one of the kind of leading thinkers on impact in journalism. And she articulates beyond eyeballs, which that can be in the industry we sort of call it a vanity metric. It may feel good to say we have this many people who are reading our stories, but in the end, how is that really a representation of any kind of change in the conversation on the ground in an issue? And beyond just the outputs, what are the other outcomes that you can be looking for from your coverage and from the engagement work that you're going to be doing? It's because a lot of, I think, what Karen and Katie have supported and what this group has done is not just the stories, but it's also hosting conversations, making connections, trying new ways, like Daniela's example, of reaching voices who have not participated in the news gathering process before, that I think are equally as important. So you can start to look beyond outputs, beyond quantities of things you can count. How do we start to understand who is being impacted by this work? And over time, collect enough of that anecdotal, qualitative feedback that you can get a sense, really, of the change that your work is making in the world, because it's out there. That's one of the things I've learned moving from just producing daily journalism to actually thinking more about how it changes a community over time. People read, watch, and listen to this work. They share it with their friends and family, and they get involved with issues after they learn about either a problem or someone doing something about that problem in their community. So there are lots and lots of impact examples out there. We often encourage people to put in some funding to pay for impact tracking, a little bit of follow-up. Ask for that in the grant up front. Say you want 10% of it or whatever the percentage might be to help you be able to tell these stories of impact so that you and your supporters can better tell your story together going forward. So I hope that helps.
I saw Mike's hand up. Oh, you've got the mic.
And I have the mic. I meant to mention this during my talk, and this sounds boastful, but it affects everybody in the room, and there is a reason to think about this. All the newspapers and media entities that we're talking about today who had speakers up here have all won major awards in state and regional contests. And that's great to see. I mean, it's a nice little, it's a great pat on the back for the people working on these projects. But remember that the people judging these contests are journalists generally in other states. So there are people who are looking for impact. They're looking for stories that matter. And I know from the various folks in the room, we've had awards for Journalist of the Year, Best Collaboration, and the various subject matters, whether it's business or mental health. And solutions journalism itself has become a category in contests now. So that's validation. It's great for bragging rights for the entities when we have people win. We love to win and get that kind of validation. But again, it's a measurement because people are looking at that. And frankly, there are fewer of us doing this in the state. So, if you see a contest and there's only a first and second place winner, it's because there's not enough entries in some categories anymore. It means these stand out even more than they would have otherwise because it's so crucial to what we do.
Are there other questions? Yes.
I think I can.
Jim.
Thank you. Hey, I'm Jim Schachter, CEO at NHPR. And I'm so excited that we're in this room together having this conversation, and I really thank Melanie and Steve and you for bringing it together. One question I have, public radio has been toiling in this vineyard since day one. This is how we do business. This is how we make our journalism possible. And I feel like we're at a moment where we almost, and RFA has done an outstanding job of this, where we almost have to have like a public movement in favor of and making the case for journalism as playing the central role that you, Karen, and you, Katie, understand it plays. But that in so many ways, people have voted with their pocketbooks and they stop subscribing to the newspaper, or they don't donate to the station that they listen to. And I wonder if in your experience, and I wonder what other people in the room think, if there is a need and if there's a foundation and a mechanism by which we can make this a cause in a bigger way than it is, for people to understand that without trustworthy information, without trustworthy news, their communities get sick, just like when they don't have clean air, healthy water, good food to eat.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I really am looking at Leah to talk about the convening she and others put together in Ohio for funders and journalists and researchers to look at a model of a nonprofit online news organization in Ohio who's figured out how to build community trust and throw open their doors and make it a pillar of the community. And one thing that stood out for me in that trip was, you'll tell me the name of the person who escapes me, who spoke to us. But he had said many of the people in the community viewed his news outlet as against the community because they were doing investigative reporting or, providing facts that were sometimes inconvenient. And he set about, I think, years-long work of really turning that story around to be one of, we're a part of the community, we're a pillar of the community, and we care about it deeply. And we want you to feel like our news organization is approachable, and we're a center for culture and ideas, and come on in. So I don't know if you wanted to say more about that, because I think it speaks to this need of making the community really engaged and passionate about their news organization and want to support it.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. That was the Richland Source, which is a little online newsroom, actually for-profit newsroom, not a nonprofit newsroom, that both for-profits and nonprofits have done this sort of community support. But it is, I think, more unique for a for-profit to be taking this kind of community funding, mission-based work. So the head of that newsroom is Jay Allred, who is a longtime friend of Solutions Journalism Network. I think Todd Franco from RFA was at this gathering that Karen mentioned, and it was just a small gathering about this size, actually, that we hosted in the newsroom in rural Ohio. People had to get on buses for an hour in each direction and come to this small newsroom, in the cornfields near where I grew up in Ohio. We got people there because we said it is still less time than getting through traffic from JFK to Manhattan if you come on the bus through the Ohio cornfields. And that was, one of our efforts to do what you're all doing here, which is start the conversation between people who are committed to building community and journalists who, of course, are committed to doing the same thing. And I would just add one thing to Jim's question, which is a data point that hasn't been referenced yet today that I think is very powerful. And that's the Pew Research Center did a study a couple years ago that said something around 75% of Americans believe that their local news organizations are healthy financially. They're doing well. And that 14% of Americans have paid for local news in the last year. So I think there's power in just asking the question, but that only gets to half of Jim's question, which is how do we galvanize existing supporters, right? So that's kind of one lane of work. I think the other lane of work is how do you access audiences who have not had either relationships at all with local news organizations or who have not had good positive relationships, feeling trusted, respected, reflective of their community in your news organization. And there's a lot of really important restorative work that's being done right now all across the country and here, with the Race and Equity Project being, I think, first and foremost from the collaborative, to start to make those repairs and figure out what is news going to look like 50 years from now that's going to build that new trust with a new audience, as well as, kind of the usual suspects. So I think it's both.
And I would just add one last point to those great ones, is just to get everyone to rally around journalism, that's still going to be a small subsector. Everyone in this room might be there, but so, we found at the foundation, we do a fair amount of work in public policy, and if you talk to people, should we be doing public policy? Is that critical? It's very hard to connect with that. But should we be doing everything we can to ensure the strength of public education in your community? Absolutely. So it's what journalism brings. I would skip over that word and rally people around making sure you have the information you need about what's going on in your community, and your decision makers are hearing your voices about how to address it. And that's just a nuance, but I think that will bring more people to this cause.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one last question, and then, as I said, there'll be time after formal presentations for networking. At the NACI S. Loeb School of Communications, we run something called the New Hampshire Solutions Journalism Lab, and we act as a funding partner to for-profit news outlets that want to receive grants or donations and need that fiscal agency of a nonprofit. So aside from connecting with me, if there's something that I can do to help you, I'm curious what your advice would be for news outlets in the room who maybe aren't doing this work right now but want to get started, or those that have been doing this work for a very long time and want to do more of it. How can they get your attention? How can they connect with you and share the work that they're doing or want to do in order to move towards a funding relationship?
Yeah, I think it's it ultimately has to be about alignment. That I talked about the sweet spot. You may come pitching an idea. We may have, we do have priority areas that we fund in. We're much more targeted than the charitable, which is very broad funder. And so we want to continue exploring. My phone lines are always open and happy to meet to explore where those affinities may be. But I would also say one huge thing I learned in all of this work was, I was invited to a Lenfest Institute panel doing a webinar, and heard so many people, so many journalists on the call talking about how they were nervous approaching funders. And I just literally turned into such a dork and said, "That's so funny, because I'm just so nervous approaching you." I initially was like, are people in a newsroom going to feel like I'm coming in expecting them to pander to my organization, or like print my press release kind of a mentality? And I was really worried about making sure that our ask was credible, which is why, again, coming in with the notion of let's first just bring in a presentation of what solutions journalism is for our New Hampshire journalists and publishers and editors, just to kind of get a sense of it. I think in the past 10 years, people know what Sojo is very much, and it is a respected best practice. I remember Tina saying, don't call it a best practice, call it an emerging practice. I think we can call it a best practice now. But you know, I think that's important. Don't be nervous about picking up the phone and saying, you know, hey, person at this foundation or someone in a business who may be doing sponsorships and donations, I'd like to talk to you because I think that there's a lot of alignment in, and I forget who said it today, but there's just a certain section of people who get it, who are going to get it. Why, if we don't have a strong local and regional news ecosystem, we are not going to have a strong democracy. Well, it's arguable if we have one now, but certainly it's fragile. And without strong journalism, it's going to be further weakened. So there are a lot of people out there who get that.
Yeah, I think that's great, Karen. And I would just say, you don't have to fight to get our attention. We get it. We're there. And as we increase our emphasis on civic health, you know, we hope to be able to do more. We can't fund it all. We don't have that scale. And we can't fund every single newsroom in the state, obviously. It would be important, but we would love to know what you're working on. And you can do that through the local program officer in your community, which is on our website. You can do it through where we have wide open grant application programs. Our Express Grants program, it did just close, but I know a couple in the room have applied there, which is great. And just call us. If you don't know who to call, just call us and we'll route you to the right person. It would be helpful, I think it would be important to know what we are funding that's out there and be utilizing those resources. So the Granite State News Collaborative is a major investment of ours, and making sure your news outlet is taking advantage of the partnerships available around that, which I know most of you are, excuse me. So that would be important. And just talk to us, yeah. It's, you know, even the question around impact, I wouldn't worry about being able to make the case and having all the I's dotted and all of that before you talk to us. You know, we want to know more about what's going on in the community. We'd welcome learning what you're thinking about it, and we may or may not be able to help, but we appreciate being connected.
And take the long view. I think it took us a while to build a relationship with the collaborative to the point where I think it was when Johnny Bassett came and presented his data expertise to our program committee. It kind of loosened up the pickle jar a little more and pushed us over the finish line to say it's time for a capacity building grant. Same with Naki Loeb and the union leader who started the Solutions Lab. You know, we're thrilled. I was saying to somebody today, if the endowment did nothing else to fund journalism, and of course that's not going to be the case, but it's already got a life of its own, and that's very gratifying to see how sustainable this practice has come. And you know, if not for the innovative thinking of like, let's start up a whole solutions lab. If we did one underwritten coverage project, you know, we're interested in this issue and this issue, and let's get funding tracks up and running. And you guys have been amazingly innovative in getting that up and running and becoming a source where other newsrooms can go. Because while we can make a grant to a for-profit directly, it's kind of harder to justify, and there's some legalities around it. But when you have a nonprofit fiscal sponsor who can serve that role, it kind of takes the pressure off the news outlet. You know, you don't have to start a nonprofit necessarily. There's somebody who can help you with that fiscal sponsorship. Just lastly, for the funders in the room who are interested, we've got to keep talking to each other so that when a news outlet approaches us with an idea and it's not something we can fund as one organization, we can say, yeah, but I know so-and-so foundation is absolutely interested in that, and let me make a connection. So we've got to do a better job on our side as funders to create kind of immediate impact funders here in the region so that we can better connect journalists who've got great ideas for coverage or who need other capacity building support to get them to the right place. There's more work to do there.
Thank you. I agree with Karen, what you said, and Katie, all your points, and I would just encourage the journalists in the room to talk to one another as well. Just like the funders are conversing and these sort of concentric circles aligning today is important. You can also have a conversation with a peer editor who has been through this process before. And then taking the long view, just to emphasize Karen's point, when I worked with Sharon Chan at the Seattle Times, who was one of the first people whose jobs I know of in this industry was purely about creating more community support for a for-profit, locally owned newspaper, like many of the ones that are here today. She said, there's not going to be anything for me to show for my work for 12 to 18 months, and said to the publisher, is that okay? And it takes a really brave publisher and a really brave news leadership group, and I also think local ownership, to be able to say, yes, this is a long-term investment we're making in our community, because it's too important that we exist, that our partners exist in other communities around the state, and that they continue to work together through the kind of collaborative spirit that we see here in New Hampshire. And so Sharon, now has been very successful in the Seattle Times and others, galvanizing this kind of philanthropic and community support. But it might take a year or longer to develop these kinds of relationships. So if at first you don't succeed, try and try again. When you're applying for grants that are on a timeline, if you are not accepted, this might have just not been your year. Try again, keep up the conversation. And that can feel a little foreign to journalists and newsrooms especially, but I'm also here and not too far away if anyone ever wants to have a conversation. And I echo the offers for support that others have shared here today.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Katie and Karen and Leah. Really appreciate the leadership that you are showing in New Hampshire. Personally, I'm grateful for our connections and the ability to work together to support journalism in the state. And thanks for being here. We're going to have just a few closing thoughts, and then we'll release you for the rest of your day. Thank you. Thank you.
I don't think I can share anything wiser than what you heard just on that last panel. I'm really here to usher you all into the next phase, which is really connecting with one another in conversation and really mulling over some of these fantastic ideas that you've heard today. I just wanted to thank everyone for a really inspiring afternoon. It's so incredible to hear what you're building here across New Hampshire. It's incredible to hear the stories of local reporters who served their communities in new and creative ways. Daniela, I'm taking building at the speed of trust back with us. That's fantastic. I love just hearing the incredible examples of how folks innovated and found new and creative ways to serve the community throughout the pandemic, and I know that will continue long into the future. I want to echo something that I heard on this last panel that really stuck with me, which is just you have all of the ingredients here to succeed and build a really, really strong future, not only for the state, but for that local news information ecosystem that you're working so hard to build and maintain and grow. And I'm just reminded that local is really at the heart of all of this, of the event, of the great work that you're doing. One of the things that we know is that although trust in journalists and journalism as an institution has fallen over the course of the last several years, that trust in local journalism and local journalists is actually stronger. And it's evident to me, as we heard from all of our speakers today, just why that is, just how dedicated these folks are to their community and the incredible philanthropic partners that are supporting that work. So I think now really all that's to it is to keep that urgency, really keep the fire underneath us to build what's coming next. You all have everything you need here, but if there's anything that we can do to help along the way, we have an incredible network of folks across all 50 states trying to do similar things. So if there's structure, if there's a document, if you're looking for an example of an editorial independence policy, there's no ask too small, too big. Let us know how we can be helpful. And just huge, huge thanks for hosting this amazing event today and for having us. Really, really nice to meet you all, and enjoy the networking session. Thank you.
I'm getting the box. Okay. So I want to say thank you again to our event organizers, to our partners, our speakers, to all of you in the audience. Thank you to our volunteers today, Allie, Adam, and Anna, for their support and help. We're going to break in just a moment. I just want to let you know that there are resources on that back table. There's a gift for each of you for attending today. Please take a tote bag with you as well. We learned that from public radio. Thank you. Charlie Sennett, who is a co-founder for Report for America, said this: "For the future of journalism to be bright, we need to make way for new, innovative models that put local communities first, reporting for them instead of on them. Our democracies can only be as strong as our communities, and local journalism lies at the foundation of an engaged community and a functioning democracy." So as we said early on, today's summit is really just the start of what we hope will be lots of conversations about how we can ensure a strong local news environment in New Hampshire. And if you're a leader in journalism, please consider how your role aligns with community needs. Think about what your community needs, listen, and then consider ways to build partnerships that improve these communities and solve challenges. If you're a business, think about how you might partner with a newsroom in ways that position you as an organization that cares and which helps to find solutions to the challenges that your business and your community faces. If you're on the philanthropic side, please think about how journalism can support your critical work on all of the issues that you care about and that your donors care about. So whether you're a business or a nonprofit or a foundation, please keep open the line of communications with those in journalism. I think it goes without saying, but the coming years are going to lead to many changes in this field and changes to all of the things that we hold dear, because if we lose local news, we lose so much more, and I think we heard that today. So please develop the relationships and the partnerships now, today, starting today, that will help us to confront any challenges that come our way in New Hampshire. Thank you. We are so grateful for your time and your attention. We look forward to continuing this conversation, and we hope that you'll stay for some networking and continue this important work together. Thanks very much.